Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, August 13th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, a member of the American Institute of Architects, founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization now representing a growing body of more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part two. Last week we presented part one in this series. It was about World Trade Center 7. This is about the Twin Towers explosive demolition, in which we'll be examining the explosive destruction and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hello, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You submit them in the questions and information form that's online at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see it. I'll also be looking at our YouTube and Facebook streams of this webinar to see if there's any good comments or questions that come up related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
And thank you, Andy. Just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. And the for this $120 million high school, the construction administration. And before working, before that, working on had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get right into it. The Twin Towers. We have an incredible structure here with that was quite controversial in terms of its design, some calling it the crowning achievement of the international style, others heartless modernism. Robert Stern, fellow of the American Institute of Architects, called it gigantic dumbness. Right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world, outpacing the Empire State Building, which at the time was the tallest building in the world. Compare the design, though. I mean, really, the beautiful unfolding Art Deco design with the massing unfolding as it reaches the pinnacle of height. But there were some incredible innovations, though, even so, at the Twin Towers, particularly the structure and the elevators, which were designed to get 100 through 100 elevator cabs, get the occupants, 140,000 a day, to their destination in the towers in 3 tiers. So this had never really been done before, an incredible feat. But let's look at the structure, because that was rather extraordinary, because up until the time of this tower's building, there was a forest of columns in these skyscrapers. And but with the Twin Towers, we have the movement of half the columns to the outside. It's an exoskeleton with these 3 horizontal and 3 vertical spandrel panels, columns welded together in the factory, brought out and erected into place and bolted. And so on the inside, you had a massive series of 47 core columns, solid steel at the bottom, and 2-inch thick, as you see here at mid-height, 30-inch by 16-inch columns, and then very thin up at the top. In between these 2 structures, really, you had the floor systems supported by these lightweight steel trusses, which were fireproofed, and on top of which was 4- and 8-inch thick well, 4-inch thick on most floors, concrete. And then these mechanical floors were supported with 8-inch thick concrete over steel beams. So an incredible structure by any measure, creating an acre in size for each of these floors. A huge, huge building with 60 feet of open office space on the tops and bottoms of this image, and 35 feet on the left and right, which is also an innovation created by this exoskeleton structure, because you don't have all those columns around which the tenants and the architects had to design their spaces. It's an open office planning. Quite remarkable. But the price paid for that at this time in the history of skyscraper design was these columns that marched all the way around the building, as you see, every 3 feet 4 inches. Some likened it unto a jail cell, especially when you compare it to the modern skyscrapers that began to be developed in the 80s and the 90s. Which with large picturesque windows of the cityscapes below. And we had lower ceilings here than in those modern skyscrapers. We also had, at the time of 9/11, a requirement of the abatement of asbestos, which was a $5 billion project by some measures, and even more for the upgrading of the mechanical, electrical, and communication systems, which were severely outdated. And so by the time of 9/11, so some researchers have pointed out that there were only half the occupants in this building at the time. It was a white elephant, an albatross. It was, they couldn't pay tenants to come in here. So that's an exaggeration, of course. But they did actually have to pay some tenants to come in here and occupy the building. So, but let's set that aside. Other than mentioning that Larry Silverstein kind of saved the project, if you will. He had developed Building 7 that we looked at in last week's webinar, part 1 of this 3-part series, which is free to watch on YouTube. And we have Larry Silverstein purchasing in a 99-year lease these other 6 buildings associated with the World Trade Center. And just 2 weeks prior to 9/11, and putting massive terrorist insurance on these buildings. So a lot of things that need to be looked into by journalists and others who should be a lot more curious about those kinds of events beyond the scope of AE 9/11 truth. But let's look at the official story as it was developed that morning.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So what was attacked again?
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there, in a nutshell, we have the official story. Where did it come from? The guy on the street who had the story like right away? They'd been arguing about this for quite a while afterward. In fact, NIST acknowledges that most of the jet fuel burned up outside the Twin Towers, and the rest of it was gone in just 10 minutes. According to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. The North Tower was hit at 8:46, collapses over an hour and a half later. It's not that the plane hit the towers and the towers just came down in that huge explosion. This is actually quite a common myth out there. And then in the case of the South Tower, which was hit 30 stories down, 15 stories lower, the tower was hit at 9:03 and it collapses an hour later. So it's pretty much normal office fires that were started by jet fuel that caused the towers to come down, with some impacted columns, of course, which was could not possibly have been the cause of the symmetrical collapses, fairly symmetrical, which we'll be looking at. There were investigations into the tower's disaster starting with volunteers who were handpicked to bring about the story because these volunteers worked themselves into the FEMA report to develop this official story of destruction by fire predominantly. The FEMA team finally had $600,000 of funding, but which was literally nothing, and their efforts were quite hampered. They couldn't get access to the blueprints of the buildings, the actual site itself, or the steel to do a proper forensic investigation at all. So this was all turned over to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And they have finally had $20 million of funding, which was less than 10% of the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. These are three of the worst structural failures in modern history, the three. And yet they had extremely limited funding here. NIST is part of the Department of Commerce, whose leadership was replaced, NIST and the Department of Commerce, when the Bush administration came in. So they had a theory. NIST, it was different than FEMA's theory, which was essentially a pancaking collapse. This theory is a column failure theory, which says that these floor trusses failed due to massive fires at the time of the collapse. As they sagged, they pulled in the core columns, because we will see that the core columns were pulled in. But this is said to have been the cause, these massive fires causing the sagging. Well, they couldn't, sagging floor trusses can't pull in these massive columns. So NIST imposed an artificial 5,000-pound load on every connection point of the columns to the trusses. And they therefore forced in their computer model the failure of all the columns. And then this caused in their computer model the failure of the entire structure, which we'll look at in some detail. But what I want to point out right now is that these fires were diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke. They're oxygen starved. So these fires are not sagging floor trusses uniformly all the way around the building by any stretch of the imagination. So we'll look at what could have caused the collapse of these buildings, but we're going to use the scientific method. We've had it in the West for 100 years or so. Winnows error from truth, fact from fiction, fantasy from reality. How does it work? We have a question. How did the tower come down? We do some background research. How have other towers come down? We make observations, construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the tower might have come down. We don't, well, one hypothesis is jet planes, one's fire. These are reasonable hypotheses. Explosions are a very reasonable hypothesis given the evidence that you're going to be seeing today. And controlled demolition is quite a reasonable hypothesis, as you'll see today too. So we don't favor one hypothesis over another. It's an objective process based on our, for instance, on our financial or political obligations that might sway an objective opinion, but based on the evidence itself and where it leads, which is what we're looking at today. We make predictions based on those hypotheses. We test them with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report that in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis until the evidence stands up altogether and supports our conclusions. If it doesn't, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis, which is what we're doing today, until we do have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence and so forth. So let's look at, do some background research and find some of the forces that have destroyed buildings. Not that fire has ever destroyed a skyscraper before 9/11, that is to say, bring it down, but particularly steel frame fireproof skyscrapers like all three of these World Trade Center high-rises. But say in a wood frame building, it's an organic, a chaotic process. It burns through an area roughly in 20 minutes or so. That's all the fuel there is in modern skyscrapers, for instance, to burn through an area. In fact, NIST acknowledges this. Such fires did not persist at any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. The fire moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So this actually contradicts NIST's theory, which states that these fires were burning under all these trusses uniformly until they all gave way virtually at once through the sagging of those floor trusses, which pulled in those perimeter columns, according to the official column failure theory. But if we look at skyscrapers, we find that they don't collapse in fires. They never have. What would happen in a wood frame building? Well, it would fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down to the path of what is the greatest resistance, the tons of structure supporting the building for the whole life of that building, but it would fall over in a chaotic process, obeying the laws of entropy. Well, we can test what happens in steel frame skyscrapers, both fireproofed and, as you see here, partially unfireproofed buildings. This is the largest test of its kind, an 8-story steel frame building was built in order to burn it down to see what would happen. As you can see, they have massive amounts of fuel right here and throughout the building to make sure that these temperatures got as hot as they could, as any office fire could or would. I think they achieved almost 2,000 degree fires and in this test. So let's see what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, Jonathan Barnett of the FEMA team is talking about 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. So this alone is cause for a new investigation. And the results of this study indicating that the connections do not fail in massive fires, even with unprotected steel. This is extremely important. There's some warping of the beams. And that's to be expected, particularly in unprotected steel. But let's take a look at the history of skyscraper fires real quick.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, none of them did. And guess what? These 3 massive fires, and there's been several more, did not cause the collapse of these skyscrapers after 9/11 either. It just doesn't happen. And yet these fires cause this building to collapse, these buildings to collapse, these small fires. Again, the jet fuel burning up at least an hour before, almost an hour before the collapse of these towers. Normal office fires and a few broken columns. Let's look at some buildings that did collapse due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. The buildings fall over to the path of least resistance. The building is certainly mangled at the bottom, but the concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. How about some buildings that did explode? We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds with expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes, rapidly expanding. We have, and this is due to the incredible heat from the ignition of the chemical reaction of these explosives. It's very, very, very hot. And we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. We have building solids and concrete that's pulverized to a fine powder, suspended in the air. And of course, explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down high rises. That's how most all high rises are destroyed, on purpose, like you see in this series of controlled demolitions. There's only a handful of companies in the United States that can achieve this. It's a very scientifically precise process where thousands of shaped cutter charges are placed throughout the columns and beams in the building in precise and detonated in a very precise order, synchronized floor by floor, in order to achieve the results that you see here. So there's a very specific set of characteristic features in conventional controlled demolitions that we can look at and readily identify. A sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure, feature number 1. A straight down symmetrical progression is feature number 2. How does that happen? Because column supports are removed virtually all at once or within fractions of a second of each other. And this results in a free fall acceleration or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, resulting in the total dismemberment of the structural steel system and limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. And feature number 7, there's patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. There's broken up concrete floors. You don't want to have to go back and break up those floors with jackhammers later. Let the explosives do that work, because it's very dangerous work when they're all at odd angles, of course, and you can't get to all of them. Feature number 9, explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the industry, explosive demolition industry. Isolated explosive charges that are visible because maybe they are mistimed, or you can just see them better. They're going off at various floors. And then explosive charges, chemical evidence of explosive devices left behind in the residue, of course. So if you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. So if you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire has never brought down a high-rise before 9/11. And why not? Well, one reason is steel conducts that heat away from the source. It never gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit critical temperature at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. Just to keep that from happening, we apply cementitious fireproofing to the columns and beams in the building. And this is 2-hour and 3-hour fire protection, 6 times longer than it needs to be to get those occupants out of the area. Remember, fires don't persist in any one area, according to NIST, for 20 or 30 minutes. And we also regulate what tenants can bring into the buildings, what the buildings are manufactured or built out of. It's not combustible materials, the skyscrapers particularly. And just to keep all of that from becoming a problem, we sprinkler these buildings with automated extinguishing systems that put out fires right away when they're detected. So in the case of the Twin Towers, it's said that the sprinklers were failed due to the impact of the airplanes. And so we don't have evidence to argue that point. So that's not the point here. The point here is to look at the evidence of controlled demolition. And some of it is circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, can be very helpful, which we looked at plenty of and will be looking at more of today. Last week, we looked at Building 7's evidence. And forensic foreknowledge of the destruction, we know in advance that a building is going to be taken down because there's people who know and these things get out. Experts agree afterward that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion. in the matter of whether it was a controlled demolition or not. Along with video documentation, all of this can be proof which of a controlled demolition, proof which we're going to now apply in terms of this model to the Twin Towers, beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet plane impacts, not at the base of the building as in normal controlled demolitions, but in deceptive controlled demolitions, which we see in the case of the 3 skyscrapers at the World Trade Center. It's a magic show. We're being asked to look at the jet plane impacts, massive explosions, and consider that that's the cause of the building's destruction. So that's where we'll be looking for evidence first of explosive destruction. So is there a sudden onset of destruction at that location? Is there a jolt? Is there a hesitation of the structure as it meets the structure below? No, it's smooth after being standing still and then a sudden smooth descent. In the case here of the North Tower. And in the case of the South Tower, again, it's standing still and then a smooth, sudden onset without jolting, without hesitation. Remember, when columns give resistance, particularly the 280 columns at the World Trade Center, and that's just the exterior, 320 columns plus altogether, they give resistance, massive resistance. Unless all of them fail at once, you can't get a smooth, sudden. And even when they do fail, they continue to provide 25% minimum of their strength, even after they're bending. So is there a set of patterned explosions and flashes of light? Fascinating, because not until August of 2008 did we learn that the city fire commissioner, who had commissioned 500 of his first responders to record orally their first responders' experience during the day of 9/11. The court finally ordered the release of this information in 2005. We didn't even have it available to us before that. And the New York Times printed all of these transcripts. And turns out that 118 firefighters in this initial review of these transcripts are talking about very clear observations of flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena indicative of explosion. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, with these witnesses, you're going to hear the order of events, which is absolutely crucial to your understanding and to the forensic record here, the eyewitness testimony, that this phenomena is happening before the towers come down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It actually shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. It's not that the building is collapsing, causing these noises and distribution of building materials. An explosion appeared at the very top simultaneously from all 4 sides. Materials shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the 5th floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, it seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Let's see what they're talking about. Here's the North Tower on the right compared to a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, both of these buildings, has never brought down a skyscraper? Shouldn't controlled demolition have been the first hypothesis, if not the only rational hypothesis? But no, it was relegated to a set of frequently asked questions, very frequently. Why didn't NIST consider a controlled demolition hypothesis with matching computer modeling and explanation like it did for the pancake theory? Oh gosh, we had 200 technical experts, 125 leading experts, reviewed tens of thousands of documents, interviewed more than 1,000 people, reviewed 7,000 segments of video footage, 7,000 photographs, analyzed 236 pieces of steel. This is an appeal to authority. That's not a logical argument. We do not support the controlled demolition theory. Collapse was initiated at the impact floors and fire floors of the World Trade Center towers and nowhere else. Well, we'll see plenty of other places it was initiated as well, but it was indeed initiated there. Video evidence also showed unambiguously that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. They're suggesting that controlled demolition started at the bottom, so it couldn't be a controlled demolition. We'll see evidence otherwise. NIST found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypothesis suggesting that towers were brought down by controlled demolition using explosives. So we'll see later that they never looked for evidence of explosives. Do you ever see the professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and then you hear pop, pop, pop? When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building. And that building had started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. You saw about 6 of these brief flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. Flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. You actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. Each popping sound initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building. Then it would just go all around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower and see if there's any relationship to the known controlled demolition on the left. A smooth, sudden descent, for instance. Is there any similarity? Again, enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. Another loud, earth-shattering blast with a large fireball which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Do you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody at that point still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's listen to these witnesses.
So once as we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom. It was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us.
It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been
Let's keep that going.
attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, though we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom.
And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Are these credible witnesses? How many of these testimonies do you imagine were included in the final report or the draft report from NIST? 0. Not 1. I thought they interviewed 7,000 people or whatever that number was. This is absolutely inexcusable and cause, again, as all this evidence is, for a new investigation. NIST says, well, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Well, let's see if Mark Loiseau, the president of the largest controlled demolition company, can clarify this issue.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
And here's a top-down controlled demolition. You can go almost anywhere in the structure, he says. NIST says, well, the top of this building above the point of jet plane impacts drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Well, wait a minute. That completely violates Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide, like you see here with the Mack truck. Who's going to win? The Volkswagen? No. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen on top of the Mack truck? No. The lightest part of a structure, which is the weakest, cannot possibly destroy the cold, hard, intact steel below the point of jet plane impacts, because at the top it's weak and it gets stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger until at mid height it's 2 inches thick steel and 30 inches by 16 inches. And then it gets stronger and bigger all the way down to the bottom, 52 inches by 22 inches and almost solid steel. It's not going to happen. But this theory was documented in a very obscure paper submitted by Zdenek Bazant from Chicago Northwestern University just 2 days after 9/11. And it remains today the theoretical basis for NIST's column failure theory. He called it the crush down, crush up theory on September 13th. Everybody else was in shock, trying to figure out what was going on in our country. Here's this structural engineer professor laboring away to create the justification for the official theory within 2 days. And it's full of holes. The formulas are correct, but the input data is false. It's fraudulent. There are 6 key errors. Obfuscation is, I wouldn't say an error, but a strategy deployed here. But they completely eliminate an entire story of columns at the point of jet plane impacts so that they get a dynamic load, which could never have happened, falling freely for 12 feet. That's fraudulent. Double the mass up above to get it to crush the structure below. That's fraudulent. They decrease the column strength below by 3 times. That's fraudulent. And they decrease the velocity loss that would have occurred due to the law of conservation of momentum with one floor hitting another. There's a velocity loss. They completely eliminate the column reserve strength. These columns are 3 times stronger at a minimum than they need to be. Some of them are 20 times stronger, actually, in the exterior, because it was so strong, this exoskeleton, that it was designed to resist hurricanes and lateral forces. So the gravity forces, they said, could hold 20 times the weight of the floors and the live load, which is the people and furniture. So with these key errors, the whole thing is rigged at least 12-1 in favor of a collapse. This is fraud. So this fraud is exposed by a number of people. David Chandler is one who measures the data. He says, oh gosh, this is near free fall acceleration. And that's what was used by Bazant. But in reality, after 2 seconds across the bottom and the velocity down the top, after 2 seconds, the downward momentum would have been arrested, as calculated by several. If it could have begun at all, which it couldn't have without that vanishing those 12 feet tall columns, 320 of them completely eliminated from the equation. So these are refuted by engineers, but the American Society of Civil Engineers refused to publish this article by Tony Zambodi and Richard Johns. Both of these articles, their reason, out of scope. How is it out of scope to publish a peer-reviewed paper, or to peer review it in the first place, which points out the clear errors of an originally published paper? It's not. This in and of itself is fraud by the American Society of Civil Engineers, and it is being contested today. It's one of the many efforts AE 911 Truth has ongoing, which is why we need your support. So if you just look, though, at the destruction of the tower, you can see yourself very clearly that there's no crush down going on here. The Volkswagen on top is being destroyed in the first 4 seconds before it crushes anything. Look at it this way. Look at the bottom red line. No movement down until after 3 seconds. The top part is destroying itself, just like the Volkswagen would be expected to. Question is, what's destroying it? And we're coming to that. Look at it. Just like the firefighters said, with start and stop. Like the firefighters said, a band of explosions wrapping all the way around the building simultaneously and near symmetrical collapse. Well, how could that happen with sagging floor trusses with these fires? Because there were perimeter columns that were pulled in, as you can see in this video, which is looped for your clarification. It repeats itself. So the question is, what's pulling in those columns? Let's go to FEMA's report, not the report, but a documentary about the report on Discovery Television.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
The core columns let go first before the perimeter columns. That's proven by the antenna dropping first. As you see, frame 5, frame 6, frame 7. Look at the top line of the photograph as we go back to, forward to, back to, forward to, before there's any downward movement of the parapet of this building, the top of the building. Well, what does the antenna sit on? It sits on the hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? It sits on the core columns. So the core columns must be failing first, which proves the theory of FEMA, which NIST ignored and came up with their own theory because it didn't support their column collapse, their column initiation of collapse theory. So then what happens after the core columns fail? Well, they pull on the floor trusses, which then pulls on the perimeter columns, as you see here in this very rough. Let's see if we can get that video to play. Oh, interesting. There we go. It's not playing well, but you can see how if the core columns are failing below the point of jet plane impacts or at the point of jet plane impacts, it's going to pull on those trusses, which then pull on the perimeter columns. I'll make a note to fix this video for you for next time. Figure out what's going on there. And then in none of the photos or the videos do you see a top part of this building crushing the rest of the building. It's gone. We already saw it started destroying itself in the first 3 seconds. After that, there's no top part of this building visible in any of the photographs or videos. And if there were, it would have crushed these few remaining core columns well before now, but they remain standing. So how in the world could the top part of the building have crushed the lower part of the building with these remaining columns standing? some people suggest that they're turning to dust. Of course, they're not turning to dust. There's another explosion which shakes the dust off of these columns, and then you can see very clearly the top part of this, the top part of these core columns descending through the dust. Watch again. Frame by frame, you see it clearly descending all the way down. It's not turning to dust. There's just a lot of dust, as we'll see what happens to the concrete here. And by the way, does this look like a collapse to you, or does it look like an explosion, a massive series of explosions, hurling freely flying objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, a geometry of fireworks, similar to the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea? No, it doesn't look like a collapse. Do we have a straight down, nearly symmetrical progression, not into its own footprint like we saw in last week's destruction of Building 7, but outside the footprint in this case? Let's take a look at the South Tower. It begins to fall over. In fact, its symmetricality later is betrayed by the asymmetricality earlier. So we have asymmetrical loading on the building at this point. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. And this building's falling off of its seat on the building below at 22 degrees. But watch what happens after that point. Complete symmetrical destruction all the way around the building, just like the firefighters described. Floor by floor. Are we looking at a gravitational collapse? Well, let's zoom in to one corner of this destruction. What are we looking at? Hundreds of individually placed explosives blowing out of the building at the leading edge of this destruction. We're told it's a gravitational collapse, but that would be like 20 stories up above. What's going on down here? Let's look at it from another angle. On the lower right, we see traveling almost as fast as the freely falling debris, accelerating straight down through, we'll get to these squibs as you see here in a moment, straight down through incredible network of 90,000 tons of structural steel. Well, this is a 207-foot wide building, but the debris is 1,200 feet in diameter, symmetrical about each of the twin towers, as you see here in this FEMA drawing. It's actually 1,400 feet in diameter, destroying the winter gardens 600 feet away with these freely flying structural steel sections. Hang on one second. I'm going to show you the winter gardens coming up. Most of this steel is outside the footprint of the building. It's broken up, ready for loading and shipment. Building 7 was a nice, neat implosion, classic controlled demolition, versus the very explosive event that we see in the World Trade Center Twin Towers. By the way, if 100,000 tons of structural steel is distributed well outside the footprint of the building, we have to ask ourselves, what's crushing the building? This is a third of the weight of this building. And you say to yourself, oh, it must be the concrete floors. We'll come to that. Let's look and see at feature number 4. ejections of materials called squibs in the explosive demolition industry. Here and here, 60 stories down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse, and 40 stories and 20 stories. We have these puffs of, NIST calls them air, but you can see the building solids. NIST says they're produced by that massive piston or that pile driver, which is crushing down the building, and that air gets built up, the pressure in the hoistway, and it's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, if this is open office planning, right? If that air was going to be pushed into that building, it would build up in pressure equally and blow out all those windows or none of them, but not these highly geometric, specific points of explosions that are occurring at 160 to 200 feet per second. And on the left side of the South Tower, as it begins its destruction, we finally can see for ourselves what's destroying the Volkswagen. Why? It's the structure is being liquefied, if you will, destroyed from the inside, such that it can't act as a solid body and then fall off the building. This is why it rights itself eventually and falls inside and then is blown outside with everything else of the footprint. Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second or 150 miles per hour.
That is not speeds associated with air pressure. That's speeds associated with explosives, 160 to 200 feet per second. How fast is the building coming down? Well, let's time it on the left and take a look at the animation on the right. Here's 5 seconds, 7 seconds. In about a dozen seconds, each of these towers are completely destroyed from top to bottom. Well, wait a minute. I thought there was some steel associated with this. Let's first go to David Chandler, physics teacher, once again.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
64% of free fall. That is near free fall. That is acceleration. It is not decelerating when it meets the 60,000 tons of structure below the point of jet plane impacts in the South Tower. It is accelerating, getting faster and faster and faster straight down through it, almost as fast as a bowling ball falling off the top of this building. Let's look at it another way. We have a giant section of building like the North Tower, 15 stories tall, held up by this huge crane. Next to it, the same section of building held up over, well, let's give it that free 12 feet of free fall, which Zdeněk Bezant gave his magical fraudulent calculation. And let's let it go. But first, let's put 80,000 tons of structural steel, which is designed 5 times stronger, as in the case of the Twin Towers, which were actually 20 times stronger in the exterior. than needed to hold it up. We're going to let them go both at once. What happens? It's pretty obvious, right? This is 7th grade physics. The one on the right is going to fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. Free fall acceleration. The one on the left is going to meet resistance and slow down. We know this. It'll probably stop and fall off the building if it can get very far at all. It's not, but NIST tells us these both hit the ground essentially at the same time. That's how ludicrous their science is. Let's look at it another way with Massimo Mizuko's New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course, and this is another reason why yet another peer-reviewed paper was submitted, and this time published by Zudolinski, Zambodi, and Johns. Some misunderstandings, to put it lightly, related to the World Trade Center collapses. Yeah, this one was published, so I encourage you to read that. And so we have a problem here. What is it? The total shattering of the structural steel frame. What? Well, the National Fire Protection Association produces Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigation. It is the guide used by fire protection engineers and investigators throughout the country and largely around the world to investigate these explosions and fires. So what do they say? Look for shrapnel effects as effects of what? Explosions. Look for high order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances, which is exactly what we have with respect to the building, the Twin Towers. Lots and lots of shrapnel effects. The building is broken up into its original structural components, as a matter of fact, almost entirely down to its 37.5-foot lengths, ready for loading and shipment, which we'll get to where it went and how fast it went. So what about feature number 7, the lateral ejection of structural steel? The guide also says, look for blast pressure wave effects with heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, as you see here and here, descending, freely flying structural steel sections. This is not like a banana of peeling, like exterior structural steel sections folding out. No, they are hurled clearly freely flying, as you see, particularly, whoa, in this piece, back to, forward to, back to, forward to. That's 45 degrees. It's not falling. We're told this is a gravitational collapse. How does gravity work? Down. What's going on here? Forward to, out. It's going out horizontally, and then gravity begins to take over and bring it down at 45 degrees. And by the way, we can see that clearly because it's being trailed by thick white smoke clouds. What are those? Steel is not flammable at these temperatures of normal office fires or jet fuel, as you'll see very clearly in next week's series part 3 in this series. But for now, let's go back to physics teacher David Chandler and learn something about these ejections. Play. Oh, come on.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
78 miles per hour. That's enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's all this energy coming from? There's thousands of these structural steel sections and beams and columns landing almost all outside the footprint of the building, as you'll see, because we're missing some floors here. This is essentially a pancaking collapse. At any rate, we would expect to find floors stacked up at the bottom in some fashion, but they're not there. On the left is the World Trade Center North Tower. On the right, a real pancaking collapse, a building that has visible floors stacked up outside. Where is all the concrete? Well, we have to go back to the photographs to find it and the videos. It's found in midair, pulverized to a fine powder. In all the photographs and all the videos, we see where the missing 90,000 tons of concrete is. It's in this powder that works its way all the way across lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area. 30% of this dust in most of the samples is concrete. How did it get pulverized? Let's go to Governor Pataki.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, if there was 90,000 tons of concrete spread over 3 square miles, then we have to ask ourselves, what's crushing the building? We saw that it wasn't the steel. Now we see it's not the concrete. This is 2/3 the weight of the building. If it's all outside the footprint of the building, as the building's falling, it's being distributed outside the footprint of the building. What's crushing the building? We did find one of the must have been 10,000 file cabinets. This one survived because it was in an ice cream store in the basement. Other than that, there's no file cabinets found, steel file cabinets. And what happened to the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how in God's name did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments found on this building, the Deutsche Bank building. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because it hit the South Tower and sent its ejections out this way. It didn't come from the people in this airplane, which hit the North Tower, because those ejections were blocked from hitting the Deutsche Bank building by the South Tower. So where did they come from? Anywhere from firefighters. You can see by the red indicators, triangles, that many were from firefighters. But firefighters were not in the building, of course, when the planes hit, but afterward. So it wasn't from the people in the planes. It wasn't from the firefighters. We're talking a total of 2,749 victims, but only 300 whole bodies were found. 20,000 pieces altogether of bodies found. 6,000 of them small enough to fit into a test tube. How does that happen? 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, more than 1,100 people remain completely unaccounted for. In other words, vaporized. How does that happen? How did those body parts that were found get sent 800 feet from the towers in what we're told is a gravitational collapse? How can that cause such incredible pulverization and distribution of these body parts? Well, what we're seeing is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. Fire causes robust structures that are less robust than the Twin Towers to collapse, maybe, but like wood frame buildings, but they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. In other words, over if they're going to collapse at all, but not these fires, which are diminished, indicated by the thick black smoke. They're oxygen starved at the time of the collapse. So with additional testimony, such as Graham McQueen, who did the research on the 118 witnesses from the oral histories that came out in 2005 from the New York Times, he's reviewed all of those again and came up with 156 witnesses. So I encourage you to look at this article. Over eyewitness evidence of explosions in the Twin Towers. But there's a witness that cannot be ignored, and that's the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory 20 miles north in Palisades, New York, which detected signals. And FEMA and NIST relied on these reports from Columbia University. There were signals at the time of the airplane impacts, or near the time of the airplane impacts. NIST says, well, these are due to the airplane impacts. That's a logical assumption, a reasonable hypothesis, but let's test it as we need to do. with reasonable hypotheses. The North Tower is the first impact, 0.9 magnitude event, not insignificant, and a 0.7 magnitude at the second impact. And so, interesting. Let's go back and test this theory. The event happens at 8:46 in 26 seconds. Okay, but the plane doesn't impact, according to the National Transportation and Safety Board radar, which is accurate within a second, which the 9/11 Commission relied on. But that happens 14 seconds later. So how can it possibly cause the event that was recorded 14 seconds earlier? Well, the plane impacts, according to NIST, they said, we looked at the videos and we think the plane impacted 10 seconds earlier than that. Well, that's quite a difference. It's quite a claim compared to the accuracy of the NTSB radar, which is accurate within a second. They're still 4 seconds off. So what do? They go back to Columbia University and move the entire, get them to do a new report and move the entire set of data back 3 seconds. They privately contracted with them and there's a report, but they will not release it as to why, what the reasoning was for moving this set of data back. It's not public information. So it's acting funny. Let's look at the second plane impact. Cute. South Tower. I want this to behave so you can see it clearly. Well, anyway, the event occurs at 9:02 and 54 seconds, right? But the plane, again, doesn't impact until 17 seconds later. So how can it cause the event, seismic event? NIST says, oh, we looked at the videos and we did our own analysis and we think the plane, ignoring the NTSB radar, again, happened 12 seconds earlier than that. Gosh, you're still 5 seconds off. What do? They go back again to LDEO and get them to move their entire set of data back again 3 seconds in a report that they don't release. What could have possibly caused those events, seismic events, if it weren't the airplanes? Well, let's go to some witnesses. Mike Picaro, he says the whole building seemed to shake and there was a loud explosive. It was in the basement of the building, North Tower. When the two arrived at the sea level, they found nothing there but rubble. The machine shop gone, a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. They made their way to the parking garage, but found that it too was gone. I don't know how a parking garage goes missing, but that's a dramatic expression, of course. A steel and concrete fire door that weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil. A bomb had gone off in the building, the basement. Well, what are bombs doing going off in the basement? We thought the plane was where the explosions were. Well, let's listen to these witnesses who are very, very much supported by 14 others, particularly William Rodriguez here, a janitor, who had heard a bomb going off below him. He was in the basement at the sea level, I believe. And the bomb had gone off before the plane hit. Let's listen.
Was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion in the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first,
and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
Okay, so we've got some eyewitness testimony about bombs going off in the basement, and in that case, in the lobby also. Well, let's go to geophysics expert Andre Rousseau in 2012 produced a report. He says the frequency of the Raleigh waves attributed by LDEO to the impacts were on the order of only 1 hertz. But aircraft crash impacts are much higher frequencies, 10 to 100 hertz, a couple of orders of magnitude higher. And these frequencies were filtered out by the bandpass filters used by LDEO. So he says that it doesn't even allow for recording such waves, i.e. from airplane impacts. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz. Wow. The actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened before hitting the ground. So he's also saying you couldn't even detect 20 miles away the airplane hitting near the top of the structure, which is like a flagpole. It's going to absorb most of that vibration before it even hits the ground. Let's go to the collapses themselves, because again, there's seismic waves that are detected near the time of the collapse, which NIST says occurred because of the collapse. We have a 2.1 magnitude earthquake or event occurring in the South Tower, but a 2.3 magnitude event occurring in the North Tower. Well, our background is missing again. This has never happened before, but we'll show you. Encourage, if you want to see this in its entirety, search on YouTube for part 2 of this series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide, and you'll see these backgrounds. In fact, I'm going to restart the PowerPoint at this location, and let's get our images back. Make this thing work right. Okay, that looks better already. And there we go. So the event happens at 10:28 and 31 seconds for the North Tower. And the tower starts its descent before that. Okay. 9 seconds before that. But the first pavement, the first debris, the lightest debris, doesn't start hitting until a second after that. And the heaviest debris doesn't come down until about 4 seconds after that. So what's NIST to do with this discrepancy? Well, once again, they go back to LDEO and say, could you move your data back 3 seconds so it complies with our official narrative? And they do that in a report that they do not release to the public, will not release. But there's some problems here. We have some very clear primary and shear waves, very well formed. Here's the chaos happening before that. The random background motions that occur. It's never just completely still. And these very well defined P waves and S waves are occurring well before any debris strikes the ground. So what could be responsible for those? As well as the surface waves that occur before the heaviest debris strikes the ground. Well, remember those witnesses of explosions? Well, there's another witness of explosions, and that is these cameras that are shaking 6 and 10 seconds prior to the start of the tower's descent. Let's look at this one documented by Graham McQueen So this is a tripod mounted camera. So 6 seconds before, you see a big shake, which is right there. I'm not shaking this. And then 6 seconds after that, we have the descent of the tower. So just like the firefighters described, like a train running under my feet. And then you saw the beginning of the collapse. Going to the North Tower, we have a tripod mounted camera on this rooftop aimed at the South Tower. And very clearly, right about now, you have that shake. I'm not shaking it. This is publicly available footage. A large explosion on the top of the tower, and then the tower begins its sudden, uniform, symmetrical descent. So there's also seismic signals that occur before the building collapse in the second tower. Let's see, 5 seconds. Well, let's go to the beginning. We have the seismic event occurring in the South Tower at 9:59 and 04 seconds. The start of the tower doesn't begin to collapse, start of the collapse, until 5 seconds earlier. And then the first debris, though, doesn't strike the ground until 7 seconds after the seismic event. So how can it cause the seismic event? Well, NIST has an answer to this yet again. 3 seconds is what they contract with LDEO, Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, getting them to move their data back with a report that they do not release, of course, and we can't get our hands on. But what could cause that? Well, 3 seconds before the start of the tower's collapse, we have yet another tripod-mounted camera shaking, corroborating the first responders' witnesses of explosions before the collapse of the tower, the initiation of the collapse. In this case, TV station New York 1. And this one's more subtle, so take a close look. Ready, go. Watch, and very subtle. That was a shake, and 3 seconds later, the beginning of the collapse of the building. And so that's all documented very carefully by Graham McQueen. Did the South Tower shake, as we'll see. Now, the official narrative says these signals occurred near the time of the collapse, but due to the debris hitting the ground, but the debris doesn't hit the ground, actually. First of all, the concrete floors are pulverized to a fine powder. There's no seismic event coming from that, right? So that debris is not causing any seismic event. The steel is distributed in individual structural steel sections weighing only 4 to 8 tons each, peppering not the ground, but the basement structure. This is a whole plaza built over a parking structure. And so it is diminished before it even gets to the ground. It's not a building hitting the ground all at once, but it's over 15 seconds, as you saw. So, and they're equally distributed over the entire super block. And then these are also identical collapses, as you see here. So, yet they cause dramatically different seismic signatures. So how can that happen? Identical buildings, identical collapses, 2.1 versus 2.3. That's dramatic difference because these are on a logarithmic scale. North Tower is causing over 1.5 times the seismic energy created as the explosions in the South Tower. So these must be explosions, which could account for such a difference rather than identical collapses in identical buildings. Says Andre Rousseau, they can't produce extremely different energy releases. And he's the author of more than 50 published peer-reviewed papers on progressive mechanical waves in geology. Now, this is all summarized in the Consensus 9/11 project, the best evidence panel produced by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin in their excellent website, consensus911.org, in point TT7. Why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. Now, some suggest that, gosh, the Twin Towers should have produced much more a greater seismic signature, something like the way more, in fact, than a mere 6-story building that was produced a 2.3 magnitude event also. But just, you're not comparing apples and oranges here, apples and apples at all. You're talking about a 25,000 ton concrete roof that hits the ground all at once versus the concrete powder in the towers, which is completely pulverized to a fine powder, and the steel distributed over at 600 feet outside the footprint of the building, peppering the ground over 15 seconds. So there's no comparison there at all. For further research, I recommend these researchers for you to look at. And then we look at the data from the FEMA and NIST reports. The NIST report in particular, $20 million they had to spend, tasked by Congress to explain how these towers collapsed. But they had their own objective, and it's hidden in footnote 13 on page 82. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? You're stopping at the initiation of collapse? Yeah. It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation was reached. Wait, you spent 10,000 pages, $20 million, 4 years, and you have only 1/2 of a page explaining the actual collapse? Let's look at that. Structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb it. Came down essentially in free fall acceleration. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. This is just speculation. There's no supporting calculations. This is a pre-collapse report. All 10,000 pages of it is fluff designed to distract from the evidence that you've been seeing today. So we submitted a request for correction back in 2007, which you can do with federal agencies who commit fraud like this. We were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. They respond back, yeah, we agree. And NIST says, regarding the explosives, in answer to those questions which we asked also in that RFC, NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, a year later, they admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. Well, you can't find what you will not test or look for. But we have many who did, and we'll be looking at that in part 3 of this 3-part series next Thursday. In the meantime, experts agree, at least 100 structural engineers and hundreds, thousands of other architects and engineers. This structural engineer says, why? He says the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself while crushing all 287 massive core columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structure underneath didn't even exist. This structural engineer, near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. David Scott in the UK. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All 3 collapses are very uniform in nature, natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. This explosives expert Van Romero says explosive devices caused the collapses of both towers, too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures. In my opinion, after the towers were hit by the planes, there were explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Now, he's since retracted this after receiving numerous federal grants at New Mexico Tech, as did Mathis Levy, who initially had this to say before he was corrected in his perceptions.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Simultaneously. Well, how does that happen? But he joined the FEMA team, as did Mike Ronald Hamburger, and retracted statements like this. It appeared to me the charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. Where did he learn that? We've seen all kinds of evidence today that bombs had been detonated. Mike Taylor. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. He's the executive director of the National Association of Demolition Contractors. And Andre Rousseau, whom we've been looking at, who says, even if the plane's impacts and the fall of the debris in the towers and the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles away, and should have been very similar in two cases, one to the other. They were not. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated by his work, which we've only summarized in this paper. Surely, though, the evidence would have been preserved in easily the three most puzzling structural failures in modern history, so they could do forensic analysis on it in detail. But let's listen to Abulhassan Nastani, also who had a National Science Foundation grant as a structural engineer to study the steel. This is a professor at Berkeley.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
But too little, too late. All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot to China for recycling before investigators could get their hands on it and do a proper forensic analysis, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. In fact, and easily the worst structural failures in modern history. We have 400 trucks a day, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, carting this steel to these barges and sent to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting so many to arrive at the conclusion that the hypothesis that's supported by the evidence is not destruction by jet planes and fire, but by explosions and demolition. But we leave that question to you because we want you to answer it. We've looked at 8 key characteristic and some very, very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition today, particularly the explosiveness of these events outside the footprint of the building. This is not evidence of destruction by fire. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but do so again asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, eyewitness evidence, and forensic evidence, along with the forensic evidence and video testimony, this is proof to many of controlled demolition, but we're going to ask you what you think. Let Andy know on our website. There's a way you can ask us some questions and let Andy know what you think happened here at the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Andy, how do they do that?
Certainly. Okay, submit your questions if you have any at our website, ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education at the top and find the live webinars. There's a box you can type them in. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if you, now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
And while you're there, take 2 minutes, maybe 1 minute, and subscribe to our weekly bulletins. We let you know what's going on. We have an incredible conference coming up this September 11th, which we have the dates for and the speakers for. We're going to tell you about those, but you want the email notification so you don't miss that conference. And that just takes a minute. You can get informed by the evidence on our website, an incredible evidence section, which leads you through much more evidence than we've had time to share with you today, and videos and so forth. While you're there, sign the petition. Join 3,000 architects and engineers calling for a new 9/11 investigation at the World Trade Center towers. There's 20,000 others supporting them. So if you're not an architect or engineer, you can still add your name. And while you're there, please donate and support us, and become a member of AE 9/11 Truth. Hold on 1 second. And volunteer with us. How do they do that, Andy?
Yep, the simplest way to volunteer is just go to our website, ae911truth.org. There's a option there to get involved and volunteer. It's a very short application. We'll get in touch with you, and there's a number of things that you can do no matter where you are in this world. I was just talking to a guy from Australia the other day who's going to be helping us out, and we have people in Holland coming in and everywhere. So if you just got a few hours a week and you care about something that's super important, and that's an understatement, then you can make a big dent in this wall of denial that we are facing all of the time, just through a little bit of work. Again, most things are just 90% showing up. It's only about 10% talent and skill there, 90% just doing it. So we need many people out there doing it, helping us out with various projects, keeping this outreach going. So if you can donate that time, please do, and join a really important team.
Yep. I'm on it, and you can work with Andy and I and our whole expanded team of volunteers. It is fun to do something. There's the things you can do without working with others. Maybe you like to work alone. Contact your elected representatives in television, radio, newspaper. In fact, tell everybody you know, screen the AE 9/11 Truth DVDs, share them, and the brochures. You can get 100 brochures for $10, and they got all the evidence there. Just blame the architects and engineers for all of this. You know, let them call us conspiracy theorists. It's a lot harder to do because we have the technical credibility of 30,000 years of combined technical experience. So it's pretty tough to go against that many architects and engineers. And especially when they come from leading universities. One of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, for instance, Leroy Halsey, has completed the final report on the finite element analysis for Building 7. And he does a very detailed report, which we went over in some detail last week, part 1 of this series. We repeat every month, by the way, so you won't miss it. But he finds in his report that which we used in our request for correction to NIST, a new request for correction, which they are imminently required to respond to in detail. The results of this Halsey report are that this building could not have come down by fire. No way. The only way it could come down is if all the columns in the building were removed virtually at once. So there we hear that again. How does that happen? Well, the request for correction uses that report and other evidence of fraud in the NIST report. And guess what? We're taking that request for correction where, Andy?
That's right. This is the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. This is draft legislation presented to members of Congress, both in the Senate and the House. Either of them can pass it. And this is exactly where you want to go. This is where a new investigation happens. This would create a select committee, and I've heard that even the president can't veto it. And it's been written in such a way that NIST can't just send some representatives to spit out some talking points and have it all settled. They actually have to look into the evidence that Richard is bringing to the table. And of course, it's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who died at the North Tower on the morning of September 11th from an explosion, immediately challenging the official story that we have been given. And his father has worked with us for years. So to learn more about it, because that's the first step towards talking about it, you can go to ae911truth.org/justice. It's got the draft legislation there. You can print it out, hand it to a congressman when they're out talking at town halls again, hopefully in the near future. And or you could just put in your address, fill that out, and it will generate a letter for you if you don't have time to write one. It'll send it right to their inbox. And they do have to keep track of the issues that are coming into their inboxes to find out what their constituents are thinking. And I say this every week. I want to sound like a broken record because it's so true. Congress doesn't act unless their constituents get involved, unless they hear from you. So anything you can do, any kind of outreach, write letters to the editor in your local newspapers, bring to your congressman's attention the Bobby McIlvaine Act, and then this will be the path to justice for him and so many others who died on that terrible day.
Yeah, and guess what? 60 exhibits of the evidence you've been looking at today, last week, and next week are included in the petition to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. And that requires him by law to hand it to a special grand jury. And we have sued him now, forcing him to let us know if that's happened or not. And so we're expecting results very soon on that front. We've also sued the FBI, who was required to give our evidence to Congress, which they have proven to us very nicely that they have, because they've commented on it very nicely in the case of Assistant Counterintelligence Deputy Michael Heimbach, who said that our work appeared to be backed by thorough research and analysis, yet they failed to turn this over to Congress in the 2015 9/11 Commission review, which was all of the evidence they were required to give to Congress after the 9/11 Commission itself, that they acquired after that point in time. So that's pending appeal as well. So very much in action there. And we have created additional evidence in our landmark documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, where we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. I wanted to give you just a couple of minutes of insight into this documentary so you can see it and then share it with others, and then we'll get to your questions.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nano-thermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yeah, you can watch it for free on YouTube, the 1-hour version. The hour-and-a-half version is available in our store at ae911truth.org. And it includes an extra DVD of these 40 experts with much more information than we could fit into the hour-and-a-half version. So I encourage you to get the one in the store. But you can download also for free the Beyond Misinformation a booklet, 50 pages of incredible information, pulling the rug out from underneath the NIST report, providing the evidence here, and that's free. The PDF, but also you can get the coffee table version, which is a very high quality booklet to give to VIPs, have on your coffee table, whatever table you want to put it on. And share it with others. Our classic Blueprint for Truth series is also free on YouTube. And as is our 15-minute documentary on Building 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner. I encourage you to show that to people to get them started with Building 7. You know, a lot of us don't have internal biases, much less the horror of that day, which are associated with Building 7, because theoretically, I mean, according to the official story, no one died in Building 7. And it doesn't have the trauma associated with the Twin Towers going down. And most people don't even know about the third tower. Most architects and engineers are completely unaware that a third tower went down, even though it's the worst structural failure in modern history outside the Twin Towers. But I think you got some questions, don't we, Andy?
That's right. We got 3 questions. The first one says, I've watched the demolition videos, in particular the type where the demolition is a global, straight down and symmetrical collapse. In those types, the top 80% of a building crushes down the bottom floors first, and then the top 80% crushes itself from the ground up. But in the Bazant crush down, crush up theory, he has it all backwards. He says the top 10% crushes down the bottom 95 floors first, and then the top 10% crush itself from the ground up. Do you know if NIST agreed or not with Bazant?
Well, great question. NIST used this very complex paper submitted for just 2 days after 9/11. You don't write and submit a peer-reviewed paper in 2 days, okay? This thing must have been started well before that, which draws all kinds of suspicions in addition to the fraud that it contains. I don't know what NIST specifically had said about the paper itself, but they do rely on it for the theory here. They're all both on very, very shaky ground. Andy, you might have something more to add about that.
I don't have too much more to add other than what you've already said. I'm not sure what NIST has said specifically for it, but obviously the time in which it was written and submitted is very dubious. And we get a lot of great questions that come in that point out the obvious flaws in thinking and reasoning and just the overall fraud that is the NIST report. So keep them coming in, because sometimes the answers to these questions are just a head nod. Yeah, good point. The next question says, NIST was asked about the squibs and how they look just like controlled demolition squibs. NIST said that these puffs were observed at many locations as the towers collapsed, and in all cases, they had the appearance of jets of gas being pushed by the collapsing building through the windows. NIST used the word appearance, and this word means to not express or reveal a commitment to a definite opinion. Do you know if NIST ever said that the squibs were absolutely 100% caused by air pressure?
No, they try to avoid making false statements. So they mince their words with words like appearance and likely and somewhat and maybe all throughout the report. That way they can get out of, perhaps they can get out of some of the accusations leveled against them. In this case, clearly, as you saw, these squibs are measured in terms of speed, and these incredible speeds, 150 to 200 feet per second, are clearly produced by explosions, not puffs of air generated by air pressure because of a non-existent pile driver pushing air down the elevator hoistways. And those, of course, would produce and blow out all the windows at once if they blew out any of them. Not these precise points of geometrically precise explosions that you see. So anyway, no, I don't think I don't know if NIST said these are 100% caused by air pressure. It'd be nice to know if you'd be willing to do some research for us. We need help because we've got our hands tied. We can't hunt down every great question that comes our way. Because what we're looking at, actually, 99% of our work is documenting solid scientific forensic evidence and eyewitness testimony of the occurrence of controlled demolition. That's what I'm focused on personally. But we do need to be, more aware of these specific statements by NIST. So we could use your help. Thanks for the great question.
Okay, the final question asks, have you seen the CNBC video where they speculate that it must have been a third airplane that caused the third explosion reported by eyewitnesses that caused the collapse of the South Tower? Now, I'll just say for myself, I have not seen that. I've watched a lot of 9/11, so for my part, I'd be happy if this questioner sent it to us. I don't think that there's a third airplane that crashed into the towers that anyone has covered up or missed, but it would be another account of an explosion or an attempt to explain off another explosion. That's my answer.
And it seems, thanks, Andy, because I agree completely. It seems like what's pointed out here is that CNBC had a reporter speculating. And again, I don't have time to run down the speculations of reporters to non-existent airplanes, but I appreciate the question.
All right, so that is it for today. So I just want to thank everybody on my end for tuning in today and sticking with us. And again, we'll be back next week.
Yeah, because today we looked at part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction, in the 3-part series, 9/11, An Architect's Guide. Next week, we're going to go deep into the extreme heat and evidence of thermite incendiaries, nano-thermite, and more in depth into these fires and molten iron microspheres and evidence of molten iron itself. So be sure to join us. And then again, in September, it starts all over with part 1, World Trade Center Building 7, on the first Thursday at 1 o'clock. It's always Thursdays, and it's always 1 o'clock, usually, always. Until then, thanks for joining us for part 2, and we'll ask you to come back and join us. Take care between now and then, and stay safe out there. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.